Hi guys, tonight we begin a journey into the heart of an empire that shaped the known world, an empire grand and ruthless, filled with splendor and suffering, triumph and tragedy. This is not a tale of emperors and conquests, not at first. It is a walk through the crowded alleys of ancient Rome, where the cobblestones are slick with toil, where fortunes change in the blink of an eye, and where survival is a delicate thread, often snapped without warning. This is the story of why you wouldn't last a single day in the Roman Empire. It begins quietly, at dawn, with the sound of a wooden shutter creaking open. The sun rose timidly over the tiled rooftops of Subura, Rome's most crowded and notorious district, where buildings loomed several stories high, each floor stacked with lives that pulsed with tension and hunger. A layer of dust clung to the city like breath to a mirror, golden in the morning light but already warm, warning of the heat to come. Beneath the rust-coloured awnings and crumbling archways, a young man stirred. His name was Cassian, and he had just turned 17. He lay curled on a coarse blanket in the shadow of a broken column, his back sore from the uneven flagstones, and his stomach hollow with the ache of another night without food. Around him the city murmured. Chamber pots emptied from windows above, splashing into alleys with the wet slap of indifference. Dogs barked and snapped at one another over scraps, their fur matted, their ribs sharp against stretched skin. Somewhere a woman's voice rose in song, clear, defiant, but quickly swallowed by the rattle of carts and shouting vendors. Cassian rubbed his eyes and sat up. His tunic was stained and stiff from weeks of wear. The soles of his sandals flapped as he moved, barely clinging to the twine he'd tied around them. Still he rose with a kind of grace, a practiced motion born from necessity. In Subura, you didn't linger. Lingering made you a target. Already the narrow streets teemed with life. Bakers fanned coals beneath blackened ovens, their breath white in the morning air. Fishmongers threw buckets of water over their stalls to keep the flies off yesterday's catch. At every corner, beggars crouched with open hands, whispering prayers to Fortuna, goddess of luck. But Fortuna had no favourites here. Cassian slipped into the stream of bodies moving toward the forum, his gaze darting between the crowd. He knew the patterns, who to avoid, who might drop a coin, which stalls to sneak from. Today, his goal was simple: survive. He passed a butcher's stall where a pig's head stared blankly from a spike, its tongue lolling, its eyes milky. A trio of soldiers laughed nearby, their bronze cuirasses gleaming, their arms heavy with jugs of wine. They shouted at a girl crossing the street, no older than Cassian, her tunic dirty and clinging to her frame. She didn't look back. He hated them, those soldiers, not just for their leering, but for what they represented: power, safety, the illusion of control. Men like Cassian didn't have that luxury. His father had died when he was 6, trampled during a grain riot. His mother vanished a year later, taken during a raid by slave catchers. Since then, Rome had been his only parent, a cruel, unpredictable guardian who offered nothing for free. At the edge of the forum, Cassian paused near a fountain. The marble lions were chipped and mossy, their mouths spouting thin streams of water. He cupped his hands, drank and splashed his face, ignoring the stink of rot that clung to the basin. The water was barely clean, but it was cold and real, and for a moment that was enough. Then he heard it. The thud of hooves on stone, the shouts of approaching guards. Instinct kicked in. He ducked behind a pillar as a procession swept past. A magistrate in a litter, flanked by lictors bearing bundles of rods and axes, fasces, symbols of Rome's authority. The crowd parted without protest, lowering their heads. One man didn't move quickly enough and caught a strike across the back from a staff. He crumpled, groaning, but no one helped him. Cassian watched, heart thudding, until the procession faded. Power was a performance here, a brutal theatre. He turned away, continuing deeper into the forum. The air thickened with voices, dealmakers, philosophers, swindlers and slaves. Everything had a price, and everyone was for sale. By mid-morning, the heat clung to the stone like sweat. Cassian managed to lift a heel of bread from a distracted vendor, shoving it into his mouth before he could be caught. It was stale and hard, but it was food. He chewed slowly, letting the crumbs fall into his lap, glancing sideways at a woman selling figs. Her gaze met his for an instant, sharp, assessing, but she said nothing. He wandered near the steps of the Curia, where senators in white togas gestured grandly, debating tax reforms and land disputes as if the city beyond their polished sandals did not exist. Cassian wondered what they knew of hunger, of filth, of fear. Did they know the taste of mouldy bread? The crack of a whip? The sound a man made when he died in the dirt? But he didn't linger. He moved on. By noon, the heat was punishing. The scent of the city thickened. Urine, smoke, garlic, and sweat. Cassian found a sliver of shade beside a shuttered temple and crouched beneath it, trying to rest. Across from him, a group of children played knucklebones in the dust, shouting and laughing. One of them, a boy with a split lip and no shoes, caught Cassian's gaze and nodded. Cassian nodded back. For a moment, the city seemed almost gentle. Then came the scream. It cut through the clamour like a blade, high and sharp. People froze. Somewhere nearby, a scuffle broke out, a thief caught, perhaps, or a punishment being delivered. Cassian didn't move. He knew better. Noise drew attention, and attention was dangerous. But curiosity tugged at him like a thread, and after a moment, he stood. He followed the noise through the labyrinthine alleys past weavers' shops and shuttered inns. He found the crowd gathered near a columned villa, watching as a man was dragged from the house by his hair. He was older, plump, wrapped in a soiled toga. A debt collector, someone muttered. The villa's owner, perhaps once wealthy, had defaulted. The man screamed again as guards beat him, dragging him toward the street. Cassian turned away. There was nothing to do. No one interfered. The law in Rome favoured the powerful. Mercy was not a civic virtue. It was a private luxury. He wandered until the sun dipped westward, casting long shadows across the stone. Hunger returned, dull and insistent. He tried the temples, hoping for alms, but was turned away. He considered stealing again, but the risk weighed heavy. He had once seen a boy his age lose a hand for taking an apple. Eventually he returned to the broken column where he had slept the night before. He curled into himself, watching the stars emerge between the roofs. Around him, the city hummed, always alive, always restless. Somewhere a flute played softly, weaving through the air like a lullaby. Cassian closed his eyes. Tomorrow would be another day, if he made it that far. By dawn, the streets of Sabura had changed again. The fire of yesterday's punishments had already cooled into ash, and what remained of the cries and violence was only a wet stain near the curb, washed down by an early morning storm that had passed quickly, silently like a thief. The clouds hung low and silver as the sun struggled to pierce the mist, casting the district in a sleepy, ethereal haze. Cassian stirred beneath the broken column, limbs stiff with cold and his breath visible in the pale light. His back ached from the stone beneath him, but worse than the pain was the emptiness that nested in his chest. It was a hunger not only for food, but for warmth, for meaning, for something beyond the brutal sameness of the days. He sat up slowly. His blanket was damp. A stray cat nosed near his feet and fled the moment he moved, disappearing into the shadow of an archway. In that moment, Cassian envied it, its freedom, its secrecy. To be unseen in Rome was often a gift. He rose, stretched, and took to the street. The city smelled of wet clay and smoke, its edges softened by the rain. Merchants had already begun setting up their stalls beneath stretched canvas awnings, wiping water from counters and goods. The scent of fresh bread floated from a nearby bakery, rich and golden, so potent it made Cassian's mouth water. He paused at the edge of the shop's perimeter, watching. The baker's back was turned, but he didn't move, not yet. Instead, he turned and walked away, shoving his hands deep into his tunic. Something about the morning felt fragile, like glass underfoot. He didn't want to shatter it. Cassian made his way downhill toward the Tiber, drawn by the faint sound of water and voices. The river was always awake. Barges clunked against the docks, and men shouted as they hauled sacks of grain and amphora filled with wine, oil, or worse. Slaves with bare feet and broken fingernails toiled beside freemen with clipped hair and dark eyes. It was hard to tell them apart sometimes until you looked at how they moved. Near the riverside, he found Silvanus. Silvanus was older than most of the street rats, perhaps 25, though his face was weathered like old leather. He sat with his back to a crumbling wall, legs stretched out before him, carving a piece of wood with a blade dulled by years of use. When he saw Cassian, he smiled without teeth. "You're up late," he said, nodding toward the sky. "Sun's nearly kissed the Palatine." Cassian crouched beside him. "I didn't sleep well." Silvanus snorted. No one does in Sabura. Too many ghosts scratching at the windows. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the creak of wood and splash of oars. A barge drifted past, its hull laden with sacks stamped with the eagle of the legions, military supplies. Cassian watched it, eyes narrowed. They're headed to Germania, Sylvanus muttered, following his gaze. Or maybe Britannia. Not that it matters. Boys like us don't wear armor unless it's strapped on by force. Cassian hesitated. Would you go if you could? To fight, Sylvanus chuckled, then coughed. No, the army breaks you slower than Rome, but it still breaks you. At least here I know which shadows have teeth. A sudden cry rose from the wharf, a child wailing, sharp and panicked. Cassian turned to see a boy, no older than 10, caught by a merchant. His hand still clutched a fig, bitten once. The merchant struck him hard across the face, then again, shouting about thieves and vermin. Cassian didn't move. Neither did Sylvanus. Eventually, the boy was dragged away. The fruit rolled into the gutter. That'll be you one day, Sylvanus said quietly, unless you learn better tricks. Cassian didn't answer. His eyes followed the water instead, where ripples caught the weak sun in flashes of gold and grey. By midday, the mist had lifted, and the heat returned, muggy and pressing. The streets grew louder, more erratic. A funeral procession wound past, women in veils tearing at their hair, draped in blue. Musicians played somber flutes, the notes climbing between buildings and vanishing into the sky. Behind them came the bier, carried by slaves, bearing the pale body of a man wrapped in fine linen and garlands of ivy. Cassian recognized the name whispered by a spectator, a senator, fallen from a horse 2 nights ago. The crowd stared but did not weep. Death in Rome was as common as bread. Cassian wandered again, listless. He passed a street corner where a man in red dye sold charms and talismans, twisted bones, dried toads, bits of ribbon said to ward off envy and curses. Across from him, a woman painted her face with crushed berries in the reflection of a polished plate, humming to herself. Nearby, a blind beggar recited Virgil from memory, each verse sung with aching precision, his empty bowl untouched. Cassian dropped a pebble into it. The old man didn't flinch. The afternoon turned strange and sweltering. Heat shimmered off the stones. A cart overturned near the market, scattering apples and passengers alike. A noblewoman shrieked as she tumbled to the ground, her guards rushing to lift her. The driver begged forgiveness, his voice shaking. Cassian watched from a distance. The guards beat the driver anyway, not for the woman's sake, but to prove they could. He turned away before the third blow fell. By evening, the colours of the city began to shift again. Soft reds, bruised purples, long shadows stretching like claws over the cobbled paths. Cassian found a seat near the theatre of Marcellus, where the wealthier citizens gathered for laughter and spectacle. He could hear the echo of rehearsals within, actors shouting, laughing, stamping their feet. A small crowd of children had gathered by the gates, mimicking the performers, pretending to be gods and emperors. Cassian leaned against the wall and watched them. A girl with tangled curls stood on a stone and declared herself Juno, queen of the gods, her voice bold and commanding. The others laughed and bowed to her. She grinned, lifted her chin and said, "All kneel to Juno, or I'll turn you into frogs." Even Cassian smiled. For a moment the world was soft. Then the temple bells rang out, the hour of the evening sacrifices. The crowds began to move, shifting toward the holy places. Smoke rose from the altars, thick and scented with myrrh and burnt offerings. Cassian slipped into the flow, drawn by instinct. Even the faithless respected the rituals, not because they believed always, but because the gods noticed those who didn't. Near the temple of Jupiter, he paused. Priests in white robes walked in formation, carrying bowls of incense and sacrificial knives. A goat bleated nearby, tied to a stone pillar. Its eyes rolled in fear, as if it knew what came next. Cassian watched in silence. The blade fell. Blood pooled across the marble, hot and steaming, caught in a silver dish. The priest murmured something in Latin, and the crowd whispered back in reverence. Cassian turned away and left before they burned the entrails. By the time night fell, the sky was deep and bruised with stars. Fires lit the streets, casting everything in flickering amber. Somewhere music played, a lyre, soft and slow. The city didn't sleep, it dozed in fits, always half awake, always hungry. Cassian found himself walking without knowing where. His feet led him back to the same alley, the same broken column. But tonight he didn't lie down. He stood there a long time, watching the stars, listening to the breath of the city. And when he finally closed his eyes, he dreamed of silence, of a Rome that did not roar. The following morning came not with sun, but with a low, sullen sky. The air hung damp and heavy, pressing down on the city like a wet blanket. Cassian awoke with his tunic clinging to his skin, his hair damp against his forehead. All around him, Sabura stirred more slowly than usual, as though the weight of another endless day was already too much. There had been a storm in the night, a sudden one, brief and violent. It had pounded the rooftops, churned the alleys into mud, and turned the Tiber a shade darker. The gutter near Cassian's sleeping place had overflowed, and now he lay damp-footed in its wake. He sat up slowly, joints stiff, back aching. There was no hunger in his stomach that morning, not because it was gone, but because it had settled so deep it no longer felt urgent. It had become a part of him, like breath or bone. He stood and rubbed his arms for warmth. A pall of mist still hovered close to the stones, and the city looked older in this light, worn at the edges like a scroll handled too often. A few early risers passed him by without looking. Cassian watched their feet splash through puddles, their sandals dark with water. No one spoke. Rome, it seemed, was in one of its moods. He made his way down the hill, avoiding the main road where carts would soon rattle past and throw mud in every direction. Instead, he took the long path behind the insulae, where the walls leaned inwards and the air smelled of damp plaster and old oil. He passed a boy scrubbing the steps outside a wine shop. His hands were raw and red, but he scrubbed with ferocity, glancing up only once as Cassian walked by. Farther down, a woman emptied a basin into the street. It splashed his feet without apology. Eventually, he came to the old market near the Baths of Titus, where the vendors were only just beginning to arrive. The square was wide and open, with flagstones worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Pigeons pecked at the corners, bobbing their heads and cooing without care. Cassian found a dry ledge near the remains of a statue and sat. He pulled his knees close and wrapped his arms around them. From here he could see the whole market gradually waking. Barrels rolled into place, awnings unfurled, crates pried open with dull blades. A woman argued with a spice merchant over the weight of her purchase. A baker chased a rat from his stall. He watched them all in silence. Then, as if drawn by instinct, his eyes caught movement near the colonnade. Two men stood talking in low tones, neither of them vendors, and neither dressed like locals. Their togas were crisp, freshly pressed, with deep purple stripes that marked them as men of rank. One wore a ring heavy with stones, the other carried a scroll case. They spoke quickly, glancing around as they did. Cassian didn't know their names, but he knew their type. Men who dealt in words sharper than blades, who smiled with poison on their tongues. And then the scroll case was passed from one to the other. It was nothing, a quiet exchange. But something about it made Cassian's breath still. He had seen enough to know that papers moved money, land, lives. Perhaps it was a property sale or a debt reassignment or something darker. Whatever it wasn't meant for eyes like his. He looked away. His attention returned to the market. A man shouted nearby. Someone had been caught stealing. A small crowd gathered quickly, their faces taut with curiosity and thinly veiled eagerness. Punishment, after all, was theatre. Cassian stood and made his way toward the noise, not because he wanted to see, but because the crowd drew him in like a tide. At the center of the circle was a boy, barely older than 12, his tunic torn, a basket of olives spilled at his feet. The vendor held him by the hair, one hand raised. He tried to run, the vendor growled. "I want justice." The boy cried out, mouth open in panic, but the words came tangled with tears. A man in a leather vest stepped forward, one of the market enforcers. He didn't speak. He simply pulled a short rod from his belt, turned the boy around and struck him once across the back. The sound echoed. Then again and again. Cassian turned away before the fourth blow. The crowd thinned quickly afterward, their appetite sated. The boy was left curled near the stall, breath shaking, a dark stain spreading across his tunic. No one offered him a hand. Cassian walked away. He took a long path through the hills, past the broken aqueduct that bled water from its joints. Here, the city was quieter, older even. Small shrines lined the walls, each with a flickering flame or a painted idol. Offerings had been left in chipped bowls, coins, dried fruit, bits of bone. At one shrine, someone had left a child's tooth wrapped in cloth. Cassian stopped before it. The idol was rough and simple, carved from dark wood and worn smooth by years of touch. It stared out with blank eyes. He didn't know the name of this god. Perhaps no one did anymore. But he pressed his fingers together and whispered a plea. Not for wealth, not for glory, just for a chance. Then he moved on. By afternoon, the clouds had thickened again, and rain threatened from the west. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of olive trees and smoke. Cassian made his way toward the edge of the Forum Boarium, where the cattle pens lay, muddy, loud, and reeking. Here, the city's rhythm changed. Men herded beasts with long staves, shouting commands, slapping hides. The air trembled with the lowing of oxen and the buzz of flies. He passed a slave with a brand still red on his neck, kneeling beside a broken cart. The man's eyes flicked up for a moment, then returned to the wheel. No words passed between them, but Cassian felt the weight of that gaze all the way to his spine. The rain began in the late afternoon, a soft drizzle at first, then a steady curtain of silver that turned dust to mud and sent people scurrying for shelter. Cassian found refuge beneath the eaves of a granary, pressed between two barrels. The rain drummed overhead in a gentle rhythm, and for the first time that day he felt still. He watched the water run in rivulets across the stones, watched it pool in the cracks and crevices, watched it wash away the filth and blood and noise, if only for a moment. And in that moment, Rome looked clean, almost peaceful. But only for a moment. By nightfall, the rain had softened into a cold mist that clung to the skin and turned the city into a shadow of itself. The stones of Rome glistened like glass beneath the moonlight, and the gutters whispered with water that had nowhere else to go. The fires in the taverns flickered low, and the voices inside them were quieter now, dulled by fatigue or wine or both. Cassian moved like a ghost through the alleys. His tunic was soaked, plastered to his frame, and each step sent water squelching from his sandals. But he didn't stop. Something inside him kept pushing forward, not fear, not hope, but the simple, hollow instinct to keep moving. Standing still in Rome was an invitation to be swept under. He made his way toward the Aventine Hill, where the buildings stood further apart, and the air carried a faint scent of cypress and damp stone. It was a part of the city he rarely ventured into. Here, the poor were fewer, and the watchmen stricter. But tonight, there was something in the silence that beckoned him. At the crest of the hill stood an old temple, its roof partially collapsed, its columns cracked and dark with moss. No priests walked here anymore, and the offerings had long since stopped. But the space remained sacred, in its own way, untouched by the frenzy of the markets and the filth of the alleys. Cassian ducked beneath the archway and stepped into the ruin. It was quiet. The wind moved gently through the open spaces where walls had once stood, rustling the ivy that clung to the stones. A small altar remained at the far end, barely visible in the moonlight. Someone had left a garland there recently, wilted laurel, its leaves blackened by the rain. Cassian sat on the cold floor and leaned his head against the wall. He didn't pray, but he listened. To the wind, the distant sound of dogs barking, the muffled cry of an infant somewhere far below. All the noises that made up the night. He remembered a time long ago when his mother had taken him up this same hill, before the temple had crumbled, before the world had changed. He must have been 4 or 5. She had pointed at the stars, told him the names of gods and monsters. He hadn't understood then, but he remembered the warmth of her hand in his. That hand had disappeared one morning without warning, and with it the names of the stars. He closed his eyes and let the memory fade. Hours passed. He didn't sleep, not truly, but his body rested, curled into itself, still and quiet. And when the light began to shift again, when the deep black gave way to the faintest grey, he stood and made his way down the hill. The streets were slick, but empty. He passed a woman sweeping her doorstep with a bundle of reeds, humming softly to herself. Her eyes met his for a moment, then moved on. Cassian didn't speak. There was no need. As he approached the lower districts, the city began to wake once more. Fires sparked behind shuttered windows. Carts creaked as they were loaded with vegetables and clay jars. Dogs sniffed at corners and trotted through puddles. The same old rituals, repeated each day like lines in a play too familiar to forget. But something felt different. Near the forum, Cassian noticed a gathering, not the usual crowd of merchants or beggars, but a cluster of people standing rigid, silent, watching something in the distance. He edged closer. At the base of the steps leading up to the Senate building, 2 men in chains were kneeling. Their heads were bowed, hands bound behind their backs, tunics torn and dark with mud. Surrounding them were soldiers, stoic, armed, eyes flat as marble. A third man stood above them, reading from a wooden tablet. Cassian couldn't hear the words, but he knew the rhythm of them. Formal, final. A sentence. The crowd shifted. Some turned away, others drew closer. The tablet was lowered. The signal was given. One of the soldiers stepped forward and unsheathed his gladius. Cassian looked away. The crowd didn't cheer. This wasn't a spectacle for the masses. This was a warning. Quiet, efficient, merciless. The men had likely stolen from the wrong house, offended the wrong name, or simply been in the wrong place, and now they were gone. Cassian moved quickly from the square, his stomach twisting. Not from fear, but from the cold familiarity of it all. In Rome, death was always waiting nearby. It wore no cloak. It asked no questions. It simply arrived. He spent the morning weaving between markets, not looking for food, but for faces. Silvanus was nowhere to be seen. Neither was the boy who had been beaten near the olive stall. Cassian searched anyway, moving through the thickening crowds, dodging elbows and hooves and curses. He passed a sculptor carving a face into stone, a woman selling roasted chestnuts, a crippled man dragging a cart behind him with rope knotted around his waist. All of them familiar. None of them mattered. He didn't find what he was looking for. By midday, the sun returned, pale but present. The city warmed. The smell of wet stone gave way to the scent of roasting meat and sweat. Life, relentless, pushed forward. Cassian sat on the edge of a fountain and stared at his reflection in the water. The boy looking back at him was thin, hollow-eyed, smeared with grime. His lips were cracked, his collarbones sharp. But his eyes were awake. A coin dropped into the basin beside him. He looked up. A woman, older, dressed in faded blue with a scarf around her head, gave him a long look. No smile, no words. Then she walked on. He reached into the water and fished out the coin. It was small, worn, but real. Enough for bread. He stood and walked toward the baker's stall at the edge of the square. The scent hit him first. Warm, rich, alive. The man behind the counter didn't look up as Cassian placed the coin on the wood and took a small loaf from the basket. He didn't wait for change. He didn't speak. He just walked away. Bread in hand, he returned to the fountain. Sat, ate. Each bite was a slow miracle. The crust crackled, the center soft and steaming. He savored it, chewing slowly, eyes half closed. It was the first full loaf he had tasted in weeks. When he finished, he leaned back against the stone and looked up at the sky. It was blue now. For a moment, he let himself believe that tomorrow might be different. The sky darkened not with night, but with dust. A caravan from the southern provinces had arrived by the Via Appia, trailing a long plume of ochre mist into the city. Their arrival was not marked by trumpets or fanfare, just the slow, rhythmic trudge of hooves and wheels, the creak of overloaded carts, the grumble of foreign tongues thick with the cadence of Numidia and Mauritania. Rome swallowed them the way it always did, completely, silently. Cassian stood at the edge of the thoroughfare, watching the procession as it entered through the Servian wall. There were merchants in cloaks of dyed wool, slaves with iron collars carrying jugs on their backs, and guards in patched leather armor, eyes darting between rooftops and shadows. Among them, veiled women sat atop litters, fanning themselves slowly, unmoved by the spectacle of the city. One of the carts carried cages, not of animals. Men, women, maybe a dozen, sat shackled together inside a wooden frame, eyes glazed and lips cracked, their heads bowed low. Some bore the burn marks of branding irons, others wore nothing but rags and bruises. Their feet were caked with blood and road dust. One of them, a boy not much older than Cassian, lifted his head and looked directly at him. It was not a pleading look. It held no fear, only exhaustion, and a question that never made it into words. Cassian looked away. He walked the long way around the Palatine, past gardens lined with trimmed hedges and fig trees heavy with unpicked fruit. The scent of jasmine rose in the warm air, clashing violently with the images in his mind. Rome was always like this. beauty beside horror, silence beside screams. He found himself near the Circus Maximus, though there was no race that day. The stands were empty, the track abandoned. Weeds grew between the cracks in the stone, and pigeons made their homes beneath the seats where emperors once sat. Cassian climbed the outer steps and looked down at the massive arena, imagining the roar that once filled it. Chariots spinning dust, horses foaming at the mouth, crowds tearing their throats with screams for glory. Now there was only wind. He sat there a long time, knees drawn to his chest, listening to the empty song of the stones. And then came the bells. Not the temple bells, nor the market gongs. Funeral bells, low and slow, heavy as smoke. He rose and followed the sound. The procession moved through the heart of the Aventine, small and solemn. At its centre, 4 men carried a litter draped in black cloth. Behind it walked mourners in veils, their faces pale, their movements rehearsed. A young man, perhaps the son, walked with bowed head, his hands clenched at his sides. Cassian watched from beneath a stone arch, unmoving. He did not know the dead. But the dead did not need to be known. In Rome, death was public, always. It reminded the city it was human. At the end of the procession came the cart of offerings, clay lamps, incense, coins for Charon. The driver paused near where Cassian stood to tighten a slipping strap. For just a moment, Cassian saw the urn beneath the cloth, marble, smooth, etched with laurels. Rich death, not the kind he knew. He walked away before the ash could speak. That night, Cassian made his bed beneath a collapsed portico near the theatre of Pompey. The stone was dry there, shielded from the evening mist, and someone had left a discarded tapestry along the edge, faded blue, torn at the corners, but still thick enough to warm the bones. He wrapped himself in it and stared at the sky where the moon rose swollen and orange. The sounds of the city faded slowly. Somewhere, a girl sang to a restless child. Farther off, a fight broke out, brief, violent, silenced by heavy boots. Cassian closed his eyes. In his dreams, he stood on a wide road, lined with torches, leading toward a great archway. Figures moved past him, hooded, faceless, silent. Their feet did not touch the ground. Their eyes glowed faintly, not with life, but with memory. As he walked forward, the torches dimmed, and the road beneath him cracked. He did not wake screaming. There was no gasp, no sweat, no terror, just the dull ache of return. The next morning came too early. A sharp noise, metal on stone. Cassian blinked awake to find 3 city guards poking through the ruins. One of them nudged the tapestry with the end of his spear. "Up," he said, voice flat. Cassian didn't argue. He stood, stepped back, hands raised. "You can't sleep here," the guard muttered. "This is patrician ground." Cassian nodded. They didn't strike him, didn't call for chains, but they didn't help him either. He walked away with the tapestry still damp across his shoulders. By midday, the sun returned in full, hot and white and unrelenting. Cassian wandered through the Velobarum where the tanners worked. The smell there was sharp, acrid, like death soaked in vinegar. Men worked barefoot in vats of piss and lye, scraping hides with curved knives, their hands forever stained. No one looked up. No one spoke. He passed a boy not much older than himself, hauling a dripping sheepskin toward a rack. Their eyes met. Neither blinked. Then Cassian kept moving. He reached the banks of the Tiber just as the barges arrived. Wine from the southern estates, oil from Hispania, grain from Africa. The docks exploded into motion, slaves unloading amphora, overseers barking orders, merchants scribbling on wax tablets. Cassian slipped through the chaos like smoke, unseen, unfelt. He crouched beside a barrel near the edge of the dock and watched. A jar split open nearby, and oil spilled across the stone, slick and golden. A worker slipped in it and fell, striking his head. No one stopped. 2 others stepped over him. Cassian heard the groan, the shallow gasp. Still, no one stopped. Eventually, the man rolled to his side and crawled away, leaving a dark smear behind. Cassian stood and walked away from the dock, his stomach twisting. Not from hunger this time, but from the simple, brutal weight of knowing this was the only world that existed. No gods would lift him from it. No emperor would call his name, only Rome, always Rome. The sun dipped lower, softening the angles of the city in long amber shadows. Rome exhaled, not in relief, but in exhaustion, like a beast grown heavy from its own survival. The great stones of the temples reflected the dusk like cooling metal, and the dust that clung to the air took on the colour of fire. Somewhere, a distant horn sounded, deep, slow, ceremonial. Cassian walked the southern streets near the edge of the Celian Hill, where marble gave way to brick, and the grandeur of the imperial city dissolved into something more human. Here the walls bore handprints in soot and grime. Here the air carried the scent of boiling lentils, spoiled figs, and sweat-soaked linen. No one looked twice at a boy walking alone. He passed beneath an aqueduct where moss clung to every joint and water dripped steadily into a cracked trough below. Beneath it sat an old woman with a single eye and a woven basket of trinkets, bits of bone carved into animals, rusted keys, broken brooches. She muttered to herself in a tongue Cassian didn't know. When he stepped close, she stopped and stared. Her good eye was cloudy. Her smile held no warmth. He walked on. At the mouth of a narrow alley, two men leaned in close conversation. One wore the loose robe of a physician, though his hands were stained too dark for healing. The other, younger, kept glancing over his shoulder with the twitch of a man not yet used to guilt. Between them, something exchanged hands, a vial, pale green in the dusk light. Cassian saw too much. He turned before they noticed. At the Forum Holitorium, the last of the produce sellers were packing up their goods. Broken stalks of celery lay scattered on the ground, bruised peaches mashed beneath cart wheels. A young girl swept the stones with a handmade broom, her shoulders hunched, her sandals patched with string. Her father shouted at her to move faster. Cassian stopped nearby and crouched beside a drain. He reached into his satchel, the small leather pouch he had found weeks ago, abandoned in a gutter with the drawstring still intact, and pulled out a shard of bread, saved from earlier. He chewed slowly, eyes fixed on the fading sky. Each bite was a memory of hunger denied, if only for an hour. The girl, sweeping, glanced at him once quickly, then looked away. Night returned slowly, like a veil being drawn over a dying fire. Lanterns were lit across the city, some with oil, others with tallow, others with nothing but hope. The smell of burning filled the air again, but this time not from sacrifice or punishment. This fire was gentle, domestic. It crackled beneath pots, flickered beside beds, danced on the walls of the insulae. Cassian found himself in the shadow of the baths of Caracalla, though he could not enter. Those gates were for those with coin. Instead, he lingered near the rear wall, where steam escaped through cracks and the warm scent of rose oil drifted into the night. A group of young men, clean and perfumed, exited laughing, robes spotless, teeth white, sandals new. One of them saw Cassian and frowned, but he said nothing. Cassian held the gaze for a moment, then lowered his eyes. He waited until they were gone. Then he turned back toward the lower districts, where the streets narrowed and the shadows thickened. Here the stones were uneven and the rats bolder. The walls dripped with water and old wine. It was quieter in a way that made the ears ring, a silence of absence, not peace. He passed a doorway where a man sat playing a lyre. The music was slow and mournful, each note lingering like smoke. His fingers were wrapped in cloth, his eyes closed. The song was old, older than the city itself. Cassian stopped, drawn in. A woman leaned in the doorway behind the musician, watching him with a look that was not love but memory. Cassian stood in the street and listened until the final string fell still. Neither the man nor the woman acknowledged him. He moved on. He returned to the ruins near the Forum, where the steps of a collapsed basilica offered a place to sit. The marble was cold beneath him, but dry. Around him, the city pulsed low, laughter from taverns, footsteps in alleys, the low hum of survival. He leaned back against a broken pillar and looked upward. The stars blinked faintly between the clouds. He tried to trace the constellations his mother once named. Scorpius, Aquila, Virgo, but they had shifted, or perhaps he had. In the darkness, the shape of the city changed. Rome was never still. It moved even when asleep. It whispered through cracks and flues, moaned through its stone and iron, spoke in the cries of babes and the muttering of madmen. It breathed, and in that breath was everything: beauty, cruelty, warmth, rot. Cassian closed his eyes. A voice disturbed him, not cruel, not loud, just near. "You look hungry." He opened his eyes slowly. A man stood nearby, dressed not richly but with care. His tunic was stitched at the seams, his belt of dark leather. In his hands he held a cloth bundle. Cassian said nothing. The man crouched beside him and opened the cloth. Bread, 2 figs, a piece of cold fish. He didn't offer it with ceremony, just set it down between them and stood. No debt, the man said, as if reading the question in Cassian's mind. Only a moment. Then he walked into the night. Cassian stared at the food. His hands trembled before they moved. The fish was salty and sweet with the memory of lemon. The figs burst with soft syrup. The bread still held warmth, as if it had been baked that afternoon. He ate in silence, slowly. When he was finished, he folded the cloth and placed it beside the column. He did not know the man's name, but he remembered his face. As the moon climbed higher, Cassian pulled his knees to his chest, wrapped his arms around them, and let the quiet of the city wrap around him. For the first time in days, his sleep came quickly, and without fear. Dawn returned with colour. A soft crimson washed over the rooftops, turning terracotta tiles into quiet embers. Birds called from the eaves, their songs light and tentative, as if unsure whether they belonged here. The air was cooler than before, touched with a breeze that carried the faint scent of citrus and dew-soaked stone. Rome, for a fleeting hour, felt gentle. Cassian awoke with his back against the marble column, his legs stiff but rested. The tapestry that had once been sodden now lay folded beside him, its edges dry. Around him the world stirred slowly. Footsteps echoed along the distant paving stones, the occasional bark of a dog punctuated the silence, and the clatter of a distant cart whispered of motion. He stretched, rubbed his hands over his face, and sat still for a long time. No dreams had disturbed him in the night, no nightmares of chains or floods or flames, only darkness, pure and deep. And the memory of the food, of the man who had come and gone without name or obligation. Cassian rose and folded the cloth he'd been given. He tucked it beneath the tapestry, hidden from sight. He did not know why. Perhaps he thought he might return it one day, or perhaps it felt like something sacred. He made his way toward the lower market before it fully awakened. The streets were still dappled in gold and shadow, and the sounds were soft, boots on stone, voices in prayer. Temple bells rang low across the 7 hills, their tone less command than reminder. At the edge of the marketplace, he passed an old man scattering grain for the birds. The pigeons flocked around him in a flurry of grey wings, and the man spoke to them as though to old friends. Cassian paused only briefly to watch. The man smiled at him without words, and for a moment the square felt like a garden. But soon the rhythm of the day resumed. Vendors lifted the shutters from their stalls and rolled out carts of wilted greens, bruised apples, cheap wine in earthen jars. A butcher washed blood from his hands, his apron already stained from the morning's first kill. A group of women arrived with baskets slung over their hips, bartering in harsh whispers, their brows furrowed. Cassian moved through the market like a shadow, not seeking food or shelter, but presence. To exist here without notice was its own kind of safety. Then a voice, sharp and unmistakable, cracked across the stone. "Thief!" Cassian turned with the others. A boy, no older than 10, darted through the market, a pomegranate clutched in his arms. The vendor chased him, red-faced and panting, shouting curses. The boy's feet slapped wetly against the stones, sandals long lost or never owned. He turned sharply, nearly collided with a basket of onions, then disappeared into the maze of tents and columns. The vendor shouted a final threat before giving up, hands on knees, breath wheezing. Some laughed, others cursed. A few shook their heads. Cassian said nothing. He knew the boy wouldn't be caught. Not today. The Undercity had its own paths, its own rules. Those who walked with dirt under their nails and hunger in their ribs knew where to vanish. But the moment left a stain. Cassian drifted westward, toward the old granaries that overlooked the river. The walls there were marked with years, layered graffiti, chipped mosaics, the ghosts of frescoes now flaking into dust. He traced one with his finger, a painted hand holding a sheaf of wheat, barely visible. He sat at the base of the wall and let the warmth of the morning touch his skin. A group of boys passed nearby, older than him, laughing loud and carelessly. They shoved one another, called out names, kicked stones at rats. One carried a reed flute, playing tuneless notes between insults. They did not see him, or if they did, they chose not to. He was glad for that. Later, he wandered toward the sacred way. The Via Sacra, Rome's ceremonial road, was a river of marble that wound through the heart of the city like a polished scar. Senators walked it in procession. Generals had paraded their victories here, their chariots dripping with gold, their captives dragged behind them. But not today. Today, it was quiet. Cassian kept to the edges, his bare feet silent against the stone. He passed a temple with open doors, the smell of incense thick within. A priestess swept ash from the altar, her motions slow and deliberate. A single worshipper knelt near the threshold, whispering to the statue within. At the top of the road near the Arch of Titus, a group of tourists stood listening to a guide recite tales of war and triumph. Their sandals were new, their eyes wide. One boy pointed at the carvings above, the menorah, the soldiers, the columns of spoils. Cassian passed without slowing. The arch meant nothing to him. Triumph was for those who had enough to lose. He followed the road downward, where it curved toward the edge of the Palatine. There, in the shadows of noble houses, he found the bakery he had been watching for 3 days. Its door was cracked open. The scent inside was overwhelming, yeast, heat, flour dust in the air. The baker, a man with thick arms and a burn across his cheek, shouted at a helper to keep the coals alive. Cassian did not go in. He simply watched, noting the rhythms, when the bread was pulled, when the oven was opened, when the baker turned his back. Then he left. Not today. Not yet. At dusk, the city shifted again. The crowds thinned. The voices grew softer. Fires returned to doorways and shutters closed against the coming dark. A group of young women danced near the fountain of Juturna, their wrists wrapped in ribbons, their laughter rising like song. Cassian watched from the shadows, the echo of that sound warming a part of him he had forgotten. He returned to his usual place beneath the broken column, the sky above him streaked with the first stars. The tapestry was still there, so was the folded cloth. He sat and drew his knees to his chest, resting his chin atop them. Tonight, there was no fish, no figs, no gift, but there was still silence. And the silence, he had learned, could be enough. The 8th morning arrived with a hush, as though Rome itself held its breath. The sky was colourless at first, a pale veil drawn tight across the rooftops. Not quite grey, not quite blue, only cold and soft and quiet. A wind crept through the alleys, gentler than usual, curling beneath doors and through cracks in the stone, stirring the dust without disturbing it. Cassian awoke slowly beneath the broken column. His body was sore but rested, his mind slow to rise from sleep. He sat up, the tapestry falling from his shoulders in a heap. There had been no dreams, no voices, no shadows, only the stillness of the night. He pulled the cloth bundle closer, fingers brushing the familiar folds. It was strange, he thought. Not how quickly one could lose something, but how deeply one could attach to what remained. The texture of the linen, the scent of old bread still lingering faintly, it was more than an object now. It was memory. He stood, stretching the stiffness from his legs, and made his way toward the slope of the Esquiline Hill. That side of the city was less forgiving. Here the tenements rose higher, stacked like broken teeth. The streets narrowed to slits, dark even in daylight. The air was thick with the tang of vinegar and sweat, of unwashed cloth and boiled cabbage. Voices here were sharper, always arguing, always accusing. Cassian kept to the walls, eyes down. A dog passed him, limping, fur patchy and ears torn. It paused beside a shuttered doorway and sniffed the stone, then moved on. Behind one window, someone wept. Behind another, a couple fought in low tones, words thick with resentment and whine. From above, a bucket of water spilled into the alley, narrowly missing his feet. He walked without comment. The insulae loomed on either side, 5, sometimes 6 stories high, their bricks blackened by years of smoke and rain. Wooden balconies jutted out at odd angles, many rotting or missing rails. Laundry hung like flags between windows, damp and motionless in the wind. Near a corner stairwell, he paused. A young girl sat on the bottom step, knees pulled to her chest, her face pressed into her arms. Her tunic was torn at the hem, her feet bare and calloused. At first, Cassian thought she was asleep, but then she lifted her head. Her eyes met his, green and wide and very, very tired. She didn't speak, neither did he. But he nodded once, and she nodded back. It was enough. He continued on. At the edge of the Esquiline, where the buildings gave way to overgrown lots and forgotten temples, he found the cemetery gates. The necropolis was not beautiful. It was a sprawl of stone and dust, tombs stacked like books without order, without care. Statues leaned crookedly, names had faded from plaques, vines crept over urns and altars alike. But the dead did not complain. Cassian stepped inside. No one stopped him. The guards had long since stopped watching the lower gates. Too many beggars, too many ghosts. He wandered between the graves in silence, his fingers trailing along the edges of the worn epitaphs. He did not read Latin well, but some names were still clear. Lucius, Julia, Gaius. Names like rusted bells. He stopped before a tomb with no markings. Its lid was cracked, half collapsed into the earth. Moss bloomed along the edges. Someone had left a candle stub beside it, long since burned out. He crouched, and for reasons he could not name, he whispered his own name aloud. Cassian. It echoed, faintly, across the stone. He stood again and left the graveyard, the word lingering behind him like a shadow. By midday the sun emerged, casting long beams through the cracks in the city's skeleton. It warmed the back of his neck as he walked, and the stones beneath his feet lost their chill. He followed the scent of baking toward the edge of the Sabura again. The bakery was open. Smoke curled from the chimney. A boy no older than himself stood outside, stacking trays beside the doorway. The baker, red-faced and shouting, worked the oven within. Loaves passed from one hand to another, fresh, round, steaming. Cassian waited. He watched the rhythm, and when the moment came, a brief distraction, a turn of the head, a shift in balance, he moved. A single loaf. Small, crusty, tucked quickly into the folds of his tunic. He did not run. He walked, slow and careful, heart pounding so loudly it filled his ears. No voice cried out. No hand seized him. He made it 3 alleys over before allowing himself to breathe. There, in the shadow of an abandoned shrine, he sat and ate. The bread was still warm. The crust cut his gums, and the inside was rough with grain, but it was the finest thing he had tasted since the figs. He ate it all. No crumbs left for birds today. In the late afternoon, he wandered back toward the place where he had slept. The light was golden now, the air thick with dust. A storm was building somewhere far off. The sky darkened in the distance, a bruise forming over the sea. Cassian didn't mind. He sat beneath the broken column once again, drawing his knees close. He heard footsteps behind him, but didn't turn. Only when the cloth was placed beside him did he move. Another bundle, smaller this time. Inside, half a peach, a strip of dried meat, a folded piece of parchment with no writing. He looked around. The man was gone. He placed the cloth in his lap, let his fingers rest on the fruit, and closed his eyes. He did not need to know why, only that he had not been forgotten. Not yet. The storm broke just after midnight. Thunder rolled across the city in long, mournful waves, deep enough to rattle shutters and stir dogs from their sleep. Lightning split the sky above the Capitoline Hill, illuminating domes and rooftops in sharp white relief. And then the rain came, hard, relentless cleansing. Rome drank it like a thirsty animal. Cassian woke to the cold slap of water against his cheek. The column offered little shelter now. Rain spilled from its broken crown, cascading down the fluted grooves and pooling at its base. The tapestry that had kept him warm was soaked through, clinging to him like a second skin. His satchel, his bundle, both drenched. He did not move at first, he simply lay there, listening. The sound of rain was not new, but tonight it felt heavier, as if the sky itself were mourning something unnamed. Eventually he sat up, his joints stiff and aching. His breath came in shallow clouds, and his fingers tingled from the cold. He gathered his things and stepped into the darkness, barefoot now, sandals lost in the night. The streets were rivers. Water coursed through every alley, gathering refuse and filth as it went. Bits of broken pottery floated beside dead rats. A wooden doll, missing its head, bobbed against a curb. Somewhere nearby a voice called out in fear, but no one answered. Cassian moved through it all, teeth chattering. He followed the edge of the forum toward the slope of the Capitoline, hoping for higher ground. There, under the shelter of a decaying archway, he crouched and wrapped his arms around himself. The wind howled through the stone, whipping his hair into his eyes. Rain dripped from the eaves in long threads. He sat that way for what felt like hours, shivering, waiting. In the deep night he saw movement. A man, tall, hooded, crossed the plaza alone. His sandals splashed through the water, each step slow and deliberate. He carried nothing. He stopped once beneath a statue, looked up at it, and then walked on. Cassian watched him disappear into the mist. He did not know why it unnerved him. By dawn the storm had weakened to a steady drizzle. The sky was a bruised grey, and the city steamed where the sun touched it. Fires were being relit in clay braziers. Chimneys coughed smoke. The scent of wet stone and ash filled the air. Cassian descended toward the Sabura again. his feet blistered and raw. He found an alcove near a tavern where warmth leaked through the cracks in the wall. He pressed his hands to the stone, soaking in what little heat it offered. A woman emerged from the tavern with a bucket, poured steaming water into the street, and vanished again. No one noticed him. Later, he wandered toward the cattle market near the Aventine. The pens had flooded overnight, and the beasts stood knee-deep in mud, their flanks shivering, eyes wild. Men shouted and cursed, dragging ropes and slapping hides. One ox slipped and fell, its bellow loud enough to turn heads. Cassian stood just outside the fence, watching the chaos unfold. A man in a green tunic approached him, holding out a crust of bread. "You hungry?" Cassian nodded, wordless. The man handed him the bread, then moved on without waiting for thanks. It was hard and dry, but Cassian bit into it with trembling hands. The crust tore at his gums, and he savoured every flake. He chewed slowly, letting it soften on his tongue. Hunger didn't fade, it only quieted. By midday, the rain stopped. The sun broke through in slivers, turning puddles into mirrors. Children emerged from doorways, chasing one another through the mud. A woman sang while washing clothes in a basin, her voice rising above the noise of the street. Cassian sat on a low wall and watched a cart struggle uphill. The driver whipped the mule mercilessly, shouting curses. The cart was too heavy, the wheels sunk deep. A group of bystanders gathered. No one helped. Some laughed, others shouted advice. Cassian stood. He stepped forward and pushed. His feet slid in the mud, his hands slipped on the wet wood, but he kept pushing. Another man joined him, then a third. Together they heaved, and the cart creaked forward. When it reached the top, the driver said nothing. He only nodded, flicked the reins, and moved on. Cassian wiped his hands on his tunic and returned to the wall. No reward, no thanks, only breath, only silence. That evening he wandered toward the field of Mars. The air smelled of wet grass and crushed herbs. The training grounds were empty, the soldiers gone, but the scent of sweat and iron still lingered. He climbed a low platform near the edge and watched the city from above. Torches flickered in the distance, voices rose and fell. He could see the dome of the Pantheon, still slick from the storm, reflecting the last light of the day. Behind him someone sat down. He turned slightly, heart quick. The same man. Dark tunic, broad shoulders, calm eyes, no bundle this time, just silence. They sat together for a long time, watching Rome exhale. Then the man spoke. "Still here." Cassian nodded. The man placed a hand on his shoulder, light, brief, then stood. As he walked away, Cassian whispered after him, not loud enough to be heard. "Thank you." He remained on the platform long after the stars returned, alone but not empty. The next morning broke clear and dry, the sky painted in pale blues and soft amber, as if the storm had rinsed every trace of smoke and ash from the air. For the first time in days, the city felt lighter, cleaner, not in body but in breath. The streets still bore the stains of what had washed away, but the puddles had begun to shrink, and the scent of damp earth now mingled with thyme and charcoal. Cassian rose slowly from the stone platform near the field of Mars, his limbs stiff from the cold and the night wind. His muscles ached from the effort of the day before, but it was a kind of ache he could live with. The kind that reminded him he had done something, anything, to resist being only a shadow among shadows. His feet were blistered but bandaged now. At some point in the night, the stranger must have returned and left a strip of clean cloth and a small cup of olive oil wrapped in parchment. Cassian had not heard him come. He rarely did. But the gifts, subtle and simple, were always left without demand or judgment. He washed his hands in the fountain basin near the temple of Castor and Pollux, letting the cool water run over his fingers and watching the ripples spread. A fish darted near the surface, vanishing beneath a lily pad. He stayed there a while, kneeling, eyes unfocused. Around him, the city began to stir. Vendors pushed carts into place, clanging wheels and calling to one another. A priest swept the temple steps, muttering a prayer as he worked. Across the street, a group of children climbed atop a broken statue, daring one another to reach its head. A woman with braided hair passed by, balancing a stack of clay bowls on her shoulder, humming to herself. Cassian watched it all in silence, not with longing, not with envy, just attention. He passed beneath the arch of Septimius Severus as the sun crept higher, warming the stone beneath his feet. He made his way toward the warehouse district behind the Theatre of Balbus, where men gathered to unload shipments brought by river and road. Here, labourers stood in lines, each hoping to be chosen for the day's work. No contracts, no promises, just the strength of backs and the hunger in eyes. Cassian joined the line. He said nothing, no name, no plea. He stood with the others, trying to look older than he was, broader than he was, more capable than he felt. The man who selected the workers, a bald figure with a copper ring through his ear, walked slowly down the row, pointing at shoulders, at arms, at silence. He passed Cassian once, then again, and stopped. "You ever lift stone?" the man asked. Cassian nodded. "A lie. Back straight. No questions. If you break something, it comes from your skin." Cassian nodded again, and just like that, he was chosen. The work was brutal. Barrels of salted fish, crates of amphorae, slabs of marble meant for a new villa near the Quirinal. His hands burned, his spine groaned, his breath came in sharp gasps. But he did not stop. He did not slow. Each task became its own world. Lift, carry, place, repeat. He didn't speak to the others. They didn't ask. By midday, sweat soaked his tunic and the dust clung to his skin like another layer of cloth. His arms trembled beneath the weight of a half-filled urn, but he bore it up the steps to the overseer's quarters without a word. When it was done, the bald man pressed a single coin into his palm. "Back tomorrow if you want." Cassian nodded once more and walked away. He did not spend the coin. Not yet. Instead, he returned to the alley behind the weaver's quarter, where the fabric scraps were discarded. He picked through them until he found a length of faded blue, stiff with dye but clean. He wrapped it around his hand like a bandage, then tucked the rest into his satchel. He walked to the river's edge just as the sun began to dip low. The Tiber flowed thick and steady, gold on its surface now. Barges moved lazily upstream, their sails furled, their crews singing rough songs between oar strokes. A heron stood on one leg near the bank, still as a sculpture. Cassian sat on the stone wall and leaned back against a pillar. He watched the water, then reached into his satchel, drew out the coin, and turned it in his fingers. It was dull, the image on its face nearly worn away. But it was real, earned, his. When the sky turned orange and the stars began to blink into view, he rose and made his way back through the city, past the temple steps, past the taverns, past the fountain where he had once sat with nothing but hunger, and finally to the broken column where the tapestry waited. He sat beneath it, his legs stretched out before him, and exhaled. For the first time, he did not feel like something to be pitied. He felt like something becoming. Nightfall brought a hush, not of peace but of pause, the kind of stillness that settles only when the city holds its breath between tides of noise. Rome lay cloaked in warmth, its stones still holding the sun's memory. Fires flickered behind thin curtains. Somewhere nearby, someone played a reed pipe, soft, meandering, half melody and half dream. Cassian sat with his back against the column, the tapestry drawn over his shoulders, the day's coin clutched in his palm. The warmth of it had long since faded, but he held it still, as if by holding it he could prove the labour had happened, that it hadn't been a fever dream of sweat and stone and aching limbs. He did not want to spend it. Not yet. Not on bread, not on figs, not on fleeting relief. Tonight it meant something else. He placed it carefully inside his satchel, tucked beside the folded cloth left by the stranger, now dry and soft. He whispered a quiet word. What word, even he wasn't sure. Gratitude, perhaps, or resolve. Then he closed his eyes. The city hummed around him like a living thing, its breath rising from every crack in the stone. He dreamed again, not of roads or storms, but of water, clear, silent, endless, and a voice, low and distant, calling a name that might have been his. When morning came, it came without noise, only a pale light slipping over the rooftops and the slow awakening of things not meant to rest. Cassian rose, his back tight with sleep, his muscles still sore from the day before. But there was something different in him now, something quiet and steady. He stretched, folded the tapestry, and slung his satchel over his shoulder. And then he went back. Back to the warehouse, to the line of waiting men, to the bald overseer with the copper ring. The man didn't ask questions, just pointed. Cassian stepped forward. The work began again. Different cargo, blocks of raw stone this time, rough and uneven, stacked without grace. His hands bled by midday, the old cuts from yesterday torn open, new blisters rising where his fingers wrapped around splintered wood. He didn't stop. He didn't ask for rest. Others watched him. This boy with hollow cheeks and too thin arms, lifting what men twice his age dropped. One or two smirked at first, but by afternoon they said nothing. The silence around him became a kind of shield. At dusk, the overseer handed him another coin. He looked at it in his palm, heavier this time, warmer, and without hesitation he slipped it into the satchel beside the first. Not yet, he told himself again. That night, he did not return to the broken column. He walked through the quieter part of the city, along the edge of the Aventine where the gardens grew wild behind tall walls. The scent of olives and old laurel drifted on the air. He passed a house with its windows open and saw a woman brushing a child's hair by lamplight. The child laughed, and the sound struck him like a knife. He did not linger. He returned to the Temple of Mercury, abandoned now, cracked and empty, the roof half caved and the floor slick with moss. But it was quiet and dry and overlooked the city like a watchful god. Cassian climbed the steps, avoiding the loose ones, and settled in the corner beneath the broken frieze. There he sat. The moon rose, slow and full, casting its silver over the rooftops. In its light the ruins softened, and the city below looked almost like something imagined, less brutal, less loud. He ate nothing that night, not from want, but from a new kind of stillness. He held the satchel in his lap, ran his fingers along the edge of the folded cloth, and watched the sky. He remembered his mother's voice, though only in shape, not words, not tone, just the echo of something once warm beside his ear. She had sung to him once. He was sure of it. Something about rivers, something about stars. When he fell asleep, it was with his hand still on the satchel and the coins still safe inside. The next morning, he did not wait to be chosen. He approached the overseer directly. "I can carry the amphorae," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The man looked him over. "And if one breaks?" "It won't." The man nodded. Cassian worked all day. He did not speak. He did not rest. When the last crate was lifted and the ledger closed, the man gave him 2 coins. Not out of kindness, but because it had been earned. Cassian took them with a nod and walked away. This time he knew what he would do. He walked across the city as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting the sky in bands of gold and grey. Past the baths, past the theatre, past the fountain where once he had sat with nothing. He reached the weaver's stall just as the shutters were being drawn. "Do you mend satchels?" he asked. The woman, middle-aged with threads in her hair and a pin in her mouth, looked him over. "I do." He placed the worn leather bag on the counter and took out a coin. "Just the strap and this seam." She took it in her hands, turned it once, nodded. "Come back tomorrow." Cassian nodded and turned to go, but paused. "I don't want it cleaned," he said quietly. "Just mended." The woman met his gaze and understood. He walked back to the temple with only the tapestry over his shoulder. No food, no coins, nothing to carry. And yet he felt heavy with something new, something like belonging. Morning light touched the temple ruins with a soft golden hush, casting long shadows through the broken colonnade and drawing pale lines across the floor. Birds had nested in the eaves, their wings fluttering gently as they stirred. Somewhere far below, a cart rumbled over loose stone, its wheels clattering like distant drums. Cassian rose slowly from where he had slept beside the crumbling wall, the tapestry still tucked around his shoulders. He stretched his arms overhead, joints popping, breath slow. His back ached, but the pain was no longer sharp. It had settled into him, like a part of his own shape. He moved to the edge of the platform and sat there, legs dangling over the side. Below him, Rome unfolded, still waking, still stretching toward its own hunger. Smoke curled from chimneys. A child's voice rang out, calling to someone unseen. The clatter of early footsteps echoed through the narrow streets. He watched in silence. After a while, he stood and made his way down into the city. He followed familiar roads, the crooked alley behind the incense stalls, the cracked archway near the weaver's hall, the back gate of the garden once kept by a retired centurion. Every turn held memory. Every stone bore the weight of other days. When he reached the weaver's stall, the shutters were already open. The woman looked up as he approached. She said nothing at first, only reached beneath the table and lifted the satchel. Its seams were whole again. The leather had been softened with oil, the broken strap mended with sturdy cord. She had not cleaned the surface or removed the stains. The folds still bore the shape of his hand. It was the same satchel, but stronger now. Cassian placed a coin on the counter. The woman looked at it, then at him. She pushed it back. "No charge for something that holds a name," she said quietly. Cassian blinked. He took the satchel and bowed his head once. "Thank you," he said. The woman nodded, and they said no more. He returned to the heart of the city, the streets now alive with movement. Messengers darted through the crowd with wax tablets tucked under their arms. Market stalls were open and shouting again. A butcher sharpened his blade on a stone, sparks flying. A man in chains walked behind a magistrate's cart, his face hidden by a hood. Cassian passed them all. He was not unseen now. People glanced at him, some quickly, others longer. Perhaps they recognized him, or perhaps he simply looked less like something disposable. He could not say. But the eyes felt different now. Near the Temple of Saturn, he stopped at a small stall run by an old woman with twisted fingers and a voice like dry leaves. "Dried lentils," she rasped. "Good for keeping. Good for quiet stomachs." He placed a coin in her hand. She gave him a small pouch, tied at the top with red thread. He thanked her and turned away, slipping the pouch into his newly mended bag. That evening, he returned to the warehouse. The overseer squinted at him, then jerked a thumb toward the northern stack. "Barrels today. Careful. They leak." Cassian nodded. He worked until the sun touched the rooftops. When the final cart was loaded, the man gave him 2 coins and a nod of something close to respect. He left without a word, the satchel swinging gently at his side. The city was quieter now. Lamps were being lit. A group of acolytes walked in procession down the sacred way, their white robes spotted with ash, their chants low and slow. The scent of cedar and burnt thyme filled the air. Cassian followed the sound until it faded, then turned toward the river. He sat on the same stone wall where he had once watched the barges pass. The Tiber was calmer now, its waters catching the last of the light. A barge moved slowly through the current, its sails folded, its crew singing softly in a tongue he did not know. He opened the pouch of lentils and took only a few, placing them in his mouth one at a time, chewing slowly, letting the salt and earth sit on his tongue. They were not delicious, but they were his, and they were enough. As the stars began to prick the sky, he walked back through the city. Not hurried, not hiding. He reached the temple ruins and climbed the steps without pause. There, beneath the broken roof, he spread the tapestry, laid his satchel beside him and lay back against the stone. He did not dream of storms. He did not dream of running. He dreamed of walking, barefoot, steady, along a quiet road with trees on either side and a river not far off. And though he walked alone, he did not feel alone. There was something in the air beside him, a presence without shape or voice, but warm. And when he awoke, the first light of morning was already waiting. The 13th morning was quiet, not with stillness, but with that peculiar anticipation that seems to linger before the day's first breath. The sky had turned pale pink above the temple ruins, and the air tasted faintly of dust and damp marble. The birds did not sing right away. They waited, as if listening. Cassian woke slowly, curled on his side, the tapestry wrapped loosely around him. He opened his eyes and blinked against the soft light. His satchel lay where he had placed it, beside him, untouched. The mended seams held fast. The pouch of lentils was still inside, barely dented. He sat up and rubbed his hands together. The stone beneath him was cool. His legs were stiff, and the faint pain along his shoulders reminded him of the barrels from the day before. But the ache was different now. It didn't frighten him. It meant work. It meant time had passed, and he had stood inside it. He ate a few lentils in silence, chewing slowly, then packed the rest away and slung the satchel over his shoulder. He folded the tapestry and left it tucked beneath the broken altar, hidden from view. He would be back. The city below had already begun to murmur. Smoke rose in thin ribbons from clay chimneys, and shadows shifted behind shutters. Somewhere to the north a bell rang once, soft, low, like a ripple in a bowl of water. Cassian descended the temple steps and followed the narrow path behind the abandoned garden, where the leaves still carried last night's dew. The air smelled faintly of sage and wet bark. A pair of cats wrestled in the grass before scattering at the sound of his steps. He took the long road toward the warehouse that morning, moving without hurry. When he arrived, the overseer was already shouting at a younger boy for spilling oil. The man caught sight of Cassian and nodded. "Good," he said, tossing a small bundle his way. "Straps and cord today. You'll tie barrels for the mule teams. If they roll off again, I'll have your skin for it." Cassian nodded once and caught the bundle. The work was slower than lifting, but no less precise. The ropes were stiff from salt and sun, and his fingers cramped after the third hour. He moved steadily, wrapping, knotting, checking the balance. The teamsters said little, but they began to nod in his direction as the day wore on. By noon he had tied 12 loads. When the sun reached its peak, the overseer tossed him a cup of water. He drank half and poured the rest over his hands, wiping away the grime. That afternoon he watched a mule stumble beneath a load. The creature went down hard, the amphorae rattling like bones. One cracked, the rest held. Cassian rushed to help, untying the cords, lightening the weight. The teamster swore, but not at him. By evening, the mule stood again, and when the load was secured, the teamster placed a fig in Cassian's palm. He said nothing, but his eyes met Cassian's with something that wasn't pity. He ate the fig as he walked back through the southern streets, the skin bitter but the flesh sweet and bright. It stuck in his teeth and stained his fingertips. He licked the juice from his thumb. He passed a woman kneeling by a doorway, sweeping ash into a bronze pan. Her child sat beside her, stacking bits of broken tile into a small tower. Cassian crouched and handed the boy the fig's empty skin. The child examined it, wide-eyed, and then giggled. Cassian smiled and stood again. He returned to the ruins near twilight, the sky a dull orange now, the edges of the city soft with dust. The tapestry was still there, folded where he had left it. He laid it out beneath the archway, sat down cross-legged and reached into his satchel. From inside, he pulled the 2 coins he had saved and placed them side by side on the stone. He looked at them for a long time. Then he took one, slid it back into the pouch, and kept the other in his palm. That night, he did not sleep right away. He waited until the stars had emerged, clearer than he remembered them in weeks. He tilted his head back and whispered each name he could recall: Aquila, Scorpius, Virgo, and others he made up, because no one was there to correct him. At last, when the breeze cooled and the city had gone soft again, he lay down and closed his eyes. The coin rested beneath his hand, and for once the night did not feel like something to endure. It felt like something earned. The 14th morning came with a low fog rolling in from the river, curling around the columns of temples and softening the edges of Rome. The sun, pale and unsure, filtered through the mist in quiet shafts that painted the streets with diffused gold. It was a morning made for whispers, not shouts, for slow footsteps and the hush of breath between words. Cassian stirred beneath the archway, the tapestry drawn close around his shoulders, one hand resting on the coin he'd kept out through the night. When he opened his eyes, he saw not sky but cloud, blank, soft, hovering above the broken roof of the temple. The city's usual sharp angles were gone, replaced by silhouettes and suggestion. He sat up, brushing sleep from his eyes with the back of his hand, and looked around. The fog muffled sound, and for a moment he imagined himself alone in a city of stone giants asleep beneath the earth. But then came the clatter of a wooden spoon against clay, somewhere down the hill, a faint cough, the thud of boots on damp stone. The world was awake, even if it pretended not to be. He packed his tapestry carefully, folded it tight, and tucked it beneath the ledge where it would stay dry. Then he slid the coin into his satchel alongside the pouch of lentils and the folded cloth, now worn soft by his handling. The other coin, the one he'd not spent nor held overnight, remained untouched. He would save it, not for bread, not yet. The streets were slick with dew as he walked, his sandals leaving dark prints on the worn stone. Merchants were slower to open their stalls in the fog. Fires crackled low behind thick cloth curtains, and the smell of damp herbs drifted through the alleys, rosemary, sage, a touch of myrrh. Cassian walked toward the warehouse district again, passing beneath arches that dripped cold water from their keystones. The voices of the dock workers reached him before the buildings did, hoarse and raw, shouting numbers, names and curses through the fog. At the gate, the overseer was waiting. "Thought you might not show today," he said without looking up from his tablet. "I'm not late," Cassian replied. The man grunted, not with irritation but with something like approval. "North lot, seals on the amphorae, watch for cracks." Cassian nodded and moved to his station. The amphora today were taller than usual, some painted with red bands and symbols he didn't recognize. Wine shipments, most likely. Imported. Valuable. The sort of thing that broke not just backs but spirits if dropped. He checked each one carefully, tapping near the base, feeling for fractures, checking the wax seals for damage. His fingers worked with care and familiarity now, tracing the smooth curve of the clay, the way a potter might before the kiln. By midday, he had sorted 3 rows. When he straightened, stretching the tightness from his spine, he caught sight of the stranger, the same one. He stood on the far side of the yard, half shrouded by mist, his dark tunic clinging damp to his frame. His hands were empty this time. No cloth, no food, no coin, just presence. They looked at each other across the yard, and Cassian nodded. The man nodded back. That was all. By late afternoon, the fog had begun to lift, and the sun returned, sharp now, revealing every stain and crack in the city's facade. Cassian finished his work and was handed another coin without ceremony. It was slipped into his hand like a secret, unnoticed by most. He left quietly, moving through the thinning mist. He passed a public fountain where a group of children splashed their feet in the cold water, shrieking with laughter. One of them pointed at him and waved. Cassian smiled faintly and kept walking. He passed the weaver's stall, where the woman sat spinning thread. She looked up and offered him a fig from the basket beside her. He paused, took it with a bow, and said nothing. She watched him walk away, her fingers returning to the rhythm of the spindle. At the edge of the marketplace, he bought a piece of smoked fish with part of the day's coin. It was warm, wrapped in fig leaf and rich with salt. He carried it carefully to the temple ruins, unwrapped it in the fading light, and ate beneath the archway as the stars began to prick the sky. Tonight he did not sit curled with his knees to his chest. He sat upright, cross-legged, facing outward toward the city. And he listened, not just to Rome's breath, but to his own. When sleep came, it came gently, as if it too had been watching him all along. The 15th day began with wind, not harsh, but steady, threading its way through the slats and stones, stirring leaves and drawing loose fabric into the air. It moved through the temple ruins like a curious guest, lifting the edges of the tapestry where it lay folded, brushing against Cassian's sleeping face until he stirred. He opened his eyes slowly. The sky above was the color of polished bronze, overcast but not angry. The city below exhaled gently, not quite awake, not quite resting. Somewhere in the distance, bells rang for a feast Cassian didn't know, or perhaps a sacrifice too quiet to draw a crowd. Rome's many voices often murmured at once, and only the sharpest ears could untangle them. He sat up, rolled his shoulders and stretched his legs in the pale light. His fingers ached, not sharply, but in the dull, familiar way that came from holding tools too tightly or lifting more than a body was meant to carry. But there was no complaint in his movements. It was pain earned, carried, familiar now. He reached for his satchel, opened it carefully and looked inside. The lentils were nearly gone. The coins had multiplied, 3 now, each resting in its own corner of the leather pouch. The cloth left by the stranger was still there, though the scent of the food it once held had faded into memory. He touched its edge and then closed the satchel. Today, he did not walk toward the warehouse. Instead, he took the long road past the Carinai, where marble mansions cast long shadows even in weak sunlight. He did not walk close to their gates. He did not need to. He watched the slaves sweeping doorsteps, the stewards receiving deliveries, the bodyguards nodding to passing officials. There was a rhythm here too, just like at the docks. A slower one, more polished, but no less predictable. As he turned toward the Sabura again, he saw a line forming outside a shaded courtyard. Men, women, a few children, quiet, still, hopeful. A man in a grey robe stood at the gate, marking names on a wax tablet. Cassian lingered across the street, watching. Bread distribution. It happened twice a month, sometimes more, depending on the mood of the magistrates or the generosity of a senator's widow. The people in line stood close, shoulders touching, eyes lowered. They did not speak much. He considered joining them, but something held him back. He turned instead toward the lower forum, his feet moving without command. There, near the shade of the basilica, an argument had begun. 2 vendors, one accusing the other of foul scales. Shouts flew back and forth, gesturing hands sharp in the air. A small crowd formed, some amused, others annoyed. Cassian moved past them. In the shadow of a colonnade, an old man sat carving birds from olive wood. His hands were gnarled but steady. Beside him, a cloth spread out with little figures. Owls, sparrows, doves. None were painted. All were smooth and simple. Cassian crouched nearby, watching. The old man didn't speak at first. He kept carving, each motion slow, measured. "You looking for something?" he said eventually, not unkindly. Cassian shook his head. "Just watching." "Most don't watch unless they want something," the man replied. "I want to understand." That made the old man pause. He looked up, squinted, and studied Cassian's face. Then he held out the piece he was carving. A tiny wren, its wings barely sketched. "Hold this," he said. Cassian took it, surprised by how light it felt. The wood was still rough. He could feel the faint edges of the blade's work, the start of a shape. The old man picked up another blank and held out a knife. "You cut where the shadow ends," he said, "not where the light begins. That's how you find the shape." Cassian took the knife carefully, fingers hesitant. He tried once. The cut was too deep. The old man said nothing, only nodded. Again, better. He carved a slow curve, the motion unsteady but improving. The figure began to take form. Not a bird yet, but the ghost of one. When the sun reached its peak, the old man took the knife back and set aside the figure. "You're not terrible," he said, which is saying something. Cassian smiled faintly. "Come back if your hands remember what they did today." Cassian nodded and rose, tucking the unfinished bird into his satchel. He walked through the crowded streets with something light in his step. Not pride, not yet, but possibility. That evening, he returned to the temple with bread he had bought at the edge of the forum, a small round loaf with olives pressed into its crust. He sat beneath the archway, the city humming beneath him, and broke the bread carefully, eating slowly, savouring the salt and oil. When the stars appeared, he pulled the wooden wren from his bag and held it to the sky. It was still rough, still unshaped, but he could see what it wanted to become. The 16th morning unfolded with a slow rhythm of breath, a city inhaling deeply before the first clang of tools or the shouts of merchants disturbed its stillness. Rome stretched gently beneath the pale sky, and the light spilled like cool milk across its rooftops, touching broken tiles and chipped cornices with even grace. Cassian awoke not to sound, but to warmth. The tapestry had slipped from his shoulders during the night, and the sunlight now rested softly across his chest, as though the gods themselves had reached down to remind him of the day. He opened his eyes slowly, letting the world return in pieces, the whisper of wind through ivy, the scrape of a distant broom, the weight of his satchel resting near his side. He sat up and stretched his arms, his spine cracking, his breath fogging briefly in the cooler shade. The city had not yet fully shaken off the sleep in its bones, and Cassian felt strangely in rhythm with it, neither late nor early, but placed. He ate a few remaining lentils, careful not to finish the pouch. Then he reached into his satchel and pulled out the small wooden wren. Its form had hardened overnight in his mind. He turned it over in his fingers, studying the places where the shape resisted him, where the wings refused to rise. The blade had cut too deep on one side, not enough on the other, but it was a beginning. He tucked it away and set off for the colonnade. The old man was there again, seated cross-legged beside his array of figures, humming to himself in a tune so low it was barely more than the breath in his chest. Cassian approached without speaking and crouched across from him. He set the wren down between them. The old man picked it up, turned it in his gnarled hands, then grunted. "Still too smooth around the eyes," he said. "But you didn't butcher it." Cassian smiled faintly. The old man handed it back, then passed him another blank and the small blade. No words, no instructions, only trust. Cassian carved in silence for the next hour, the noises of the forum fading behind the rhythm of wood and thought. The blade moved more surely now. His fingers learned the grain, the tug, the release. The shape grew, not fast but faithfully. A wing, a back, a tilt of head. When he finished, the bird was still rough, but now it seemed to breathe, just slightly. The old man looked at it, then looked at him. He said nothing, but he placed the figure gently on the cloth beside the others. Not to sell, just to be seen. Cassian stood and slipped the knife into the man's pouch, nodded once and turned to go. "Tomorrow," the old man said, "I'll show you how to smooth it." Cassian did not turn back, but his chest tightened in a way he couldn't name. He wandered north through the city, weaving between carts and cats, passing temples and shadows, until he reached the hill above the gardens of Sallust. There, he sat beneath a cypress tree and watched Rome. Below him, life flowed. Children fetched water from the fountains. A woman argued with a fishmonger. A priest scolded a stray dog from the temple steps. The city spun, pulled by 1,000 threads, none of them needing his hand to hold them steady. And yet, here he was, present. As the afternoon sun warmed the stone behind him, he reached once more into his satchel. This time he did not pull out the wren. He pulled out the coin, the first one, the one he'd kept all these days. He held it between his fingers and thought of nothing, only its weight, its journey. Then, with great care, he buried it at the base of the cypress, not hidden, not discarded, offered to the roots, to the hill, to whatever watched over boys who became things they were not supposed to be. When he returned to the temple that night, the sky was thick with stars, and the wind carried the smell of thyme and olive smoke. He laid the tapestry out as he always did, sat beneath the archway and ate a small fig someone had left in the crook of a wall near the basilica. No note, only sweetness. He ate it in silence, then lay back and closed his eyes. The city below sighed, and Cassian slept, hands resting on the shape of wings. The 17th morning arrived with a kind of brightness that startled. There were no clouds to soften the sun's edge, no breeze to carry the usual hush of dawn. Light poured hard and direct over the city, bouncing off white stone and bronze fixtures, making the rooftops shimmer like hammered gold. It was the kind of morning that made every crack in the pavement sharper, every voice louder, every shadow more certain. Cassian woke with a thin film of sweat across his brow. The tapestry, though comforting at night, had become heavy with heat by early morning. He pushed it aside and sat up, blinking into the brilliance that spilled over the temple ruins. The city below already roared, a chorus of hammers, hooves and arguments. Today there was no mist to hide behind. He rose, adjusted the strap of his satchel and walked barefoot across the stones, each one warm beneath his feet. His steps felt deliberate, as if the earth itself had thickened overnight, offering more resistance than usual. He moved through the Subura with practiced ease, avoiding the patches of broken cobble and sidestepping a brawl near the base of an insula. 2 boys were fighting over a loaf of bread, one older, one smaller. No one stepped in. A woman nearby watched with empty eyes, holding a jug of water to her chest. Cassian paused for only a moment, then moved on. He carried no bread. The forum was packed by the time he arrived. Something was happening, some announcement, some ceremony. A man in armor stood atop a low stage, speaking loudly of taxes or war or law. It didn't matter. The people listened, but not for the content. They watched his hands, his mouth, the way his guards flanked him. They watched for danger or opportunity. Cassian slipped through the edges of the crowd. Near the basilica he found the old man already seated on his cloth, carving. Today, his birds were arranged in neat rows. Cassian knelt beside him without a word, took the small blank the man handed him, and began to carve. The air shimmered with heat. The blade, warm in his hand, moved slower now, not because of uncertainty, but because the shape came clearer with less. He shaved the wood in soft curls, each motion lighter than the last, as though he were revealing something already inside, rather than creating it from scratch. The old man watched for a while, then spoke. "You carve like someone who has waited a long time to speak." Cassian didn't answer. He didn't need to. They worked in silence for a long while. When he finished, the bird was smaller than the first, more fragile, but its wings tilted slightly upward, as if just beginning to rise. He placed it on the cloth beside the others. The old man didn't touch it, didn't adjust it. He let it stay where it was. Cassian stood, brushed the wood dust from his hands, and started to walk away. "Tomorrow," the old man called after him, "you'll learn to burn the eye." Cassian turned his head just a little, and nodded. He walked until the city narrowed again, until the shadows lengthened and the smells changed, from perfume and wine to vinegar, smoke and old garlic. He passed a bakery with its shutters drawn against the heat, and behind it a stable boy whistled to a nervous mule. Near the edge of a bathhouse wall, he sat beneath a fig tree heavy with unripe fruit. And there he saw her. The girl from the insular steppes, the one with green eyes and a torn tunic. She stood barefoot in the street, holding something wrapped in cloth. She was watching a man struggle with a broken wheel, his cart tipped at an angle, baskets of fruit spilled around him. The girl stepped forward and offered the man her bundle. Cassian couldn't hear the exchange, but the man took it. She knelt and helped gather the fruit, slowly, without show. When it was done, the man handed her a small cluster of grapes. She didn't eat them. She turned, walked past Cassian without noticing, and placed the grapes beside an old woman sleeping against a pillar. Then she vanished down an alley. Cassian sat in the shade and let that moment settle into him. Later, when the sky had turned the colour of rust and plum, he returned to the temple. The tapestry greeted him with the scent of sun-warmed wool. He unfolded it, sat upon it, and placed his latest bird beside the first, lining them both along the edge of the broken wall. He did not eat that night. He watched, and whispered the names of birds he did not know. Then, as sleep came, he smiled, not from joy, but from the soft recognition of the world shifting, just slightly in his favour. The 18th day dawned with a sky too clear to trust. There were no clouds to soften the sun, no breeze to stir the leaves. Rome held itself still beneath that brittle blue canopy, as if waiting for something to break. Even the birds, usually restless and loud at dawn, were quiet in the temple ruins. The air was dry, still, and already warming with the weight of the coming heat. Cassian woke to a light that was too sharp for comfort. His eyes stung as he sat up, the tapestry slipping from his shoulders and catching the sunlight like a flare. His body was slow to rise this morning, his limbs heavy, his palms stiff from the previous day's carving. He moved with the careful quiet of someone preserving strength. At the edge of the archway, his two birds sat where he'd left them. They looked out over the city like sentinels, their wings caught mid-thought, mid-motion. He reached out and adjusted the smaller one so that it faced a little to the left, just enough to suggest curiosity. Then he packed his things, wrapped the tapestry, and made his descent into the city. The streets were already filling by the time he reached the lower forum. A rumour of grain shortage had spread overnight, and a thick tension clung to the crowds. Men stood in tight groups, whispering harshly. A pair of guards moved quickly through the square, their hands on the hilts of their blades, not from fear, but from routine. Cassian kept to the edges, slipping between carts and pillars, his feet quiet on the hot stone. He reached the colonnade where the old man carved, expecting to find him seated in his usual place. But the cloth was gone, the figures gone. Only the dust remained, faint outlines where the shapes had sat. Cassian stood still for a long time. He glanced around the square, searching for the familiar posture, the slow carving motions, the hummed tune. But there was nothing. In his chest, a tightness grew. Not panic, not quite, but the echo of absence. He crouched where the cloth had once been, pressed his hand lightly to the warm stone. Still dust, still memory. Someone passed behind him, an old woman carrying dried herbs. She slowed, looked at him. He went east, she said, as if reading his question. Too many came to buy. He doesn't like to sell. Cassian turned to her. Where? She shrugged. The edge of the market, near the olive press. Then she walked on. Cassian rose and made his way eastward, weaving past tired oxen and loud apprentices, past booths selling garlands and rough wine. He moved through smells that shifted from perfume to sweat to crushed olives. There, near a crumbling archway, he saw the man again. Sitting in the shade beside an empty cart, his legs stretched out before him, his knife working slowly at a new blank. The cloth was smaller today. Fewer birds, less arrangement, more privacy. Cassian approached and sat without a word. The old man glanced at him, then held out the figure he'd begun. No wings, he said. Cassian took the blank. It was a shape he didn't know, broader, grounded. Not all things need to fly, the man added, then passed him the blade. The wood was harder than the olive he had used before. It resisted. It demanded patience. Cassian carved slowly, letting the lines reveal themselves. The shape began to shift, sturdier, lower to the ground, a fox maybe, or a dog. The old man nodded once when he saw the emerging form. Tomorrow, he said, you'll burn the eye. Cassian looked up. You said that yesterday. The man grinned. You weren't ready yesterday. They worked side by side until the sun climbed high and the shadows shrank. Then, without speaking, they each placed their carving on the cloth, rose and parted ways. Cassian walked toward the river, his satchel heavier with the new figure. He passed children playing in a dry fountain, chasing each other with reed whistles and bits of clay. One girl wore a crown of twigs and leaves and shouted orders like a general. Another boy, smaller, followed her with wide eyes, holding her hand when she let him. He watched them for a long while. Then he turned down a quieter street, past the bathhouses where hot water steamed behind marble walls, past the wine stalls already drunk with mid-afternoon laughter, past the gate of the garden he had never entered. At the base of a small hill, he stopped. There was the cypress, the one he remembered, the one that held his coin. He crouched beside it, pressed his palm to the earth and felt, not warmth, but presence. The roots had taken it, he was certain, swallowed the metal, made it part of something living. He sat beside the tree and unwrapped the wooden animal from his satchel. Its form was still rough, but real. He held it in his lap and watched the city glow. As dusk settled, he returned to the temple and placed the third figure beside the birds. 3 now, each different, each marked with a kind of quiet. He lay back on the tapestry, arms behind his head, and whispered their names to no one, not for memory, but for companionship. The 19th morning crept into the city like a secret. The sky, still dark with the last edge of night, softened slowly into blue, brushed at the rim with dull gold. A single bird called once from a rooftop near the temple ruins, its note thin and tentative. Then silence again. The world was not yet ready to be loud. Cassian stirred beneath the tapestry, his body curled against the stone, one hand resting near the figures he'd carved. The air was cool, not with cold but with quiet, a kind of stillness that settled not only on skin but in the chest. When he opened his eyes, he did not sit up right away. He looked first to the row of wooden shapes, the wren, the smaller bird, the low creature with no wings. They seemed unchanged, and yet they felt different this morning. Not brighter, not softer, simply present. He reached out and picked up the newest one. His fingers traced the lines along its back, the groove where he'd started to carve a tail, the smoothed places where the blade had once bit too deeply. He turned it in his hands, then set it back gently. Then he rose, slowly, joints stiff, mind still climbing from the softness of sleep. The city below had already begun to move. He wrapped the tapestry and slid it into the alcove behind the column. Then he walked toward the steps, his satchel swinging low, the weight of the wooden figures a familiar pull at his side. Today, the streets greeted him differently. People nodded. Not many. Not loudly, but a few. A baker's boy lifted a hand in passing. A woman he'd once helped tie a sack nodded once from behind her stall. Even the guards near the grain gate did not watch him with the sharpness they once had. It was not trust. Not yet. But it was no longer suspicion. He reached the olive press just as the sun cleared the rooftops. The old man was there, seated on his cloth, this time with a small brass pot beside him and a curved wire resting on a plank. Cassian crouched, and the man handed him a figure, unfinished. "This one," he said, "you burn." Cassian took it. He picked up the wire, heated its end in the brazier coals, and waited for the metal to glow. The heat made his fingers sting, but he didn't flinch. He pressed the wire to the wood, the tip hissing softly. A dark line appeared, sharp, alive, permanent. He burned the eye. Then another. He sat back and stared at what he had made. The figure was simple, just a fox, crouched low. But now, with those 2 tiny marks, it saw. The old man nodded. "That's all it takes," he said, "a little fire." Cassian placed the fox beside the others on the cloth. The old man did not touch it. They sat together until the street grew louder, until the carts passed close, until the crowd pushed nearer. Then Cassian rose and made his way east. He walked past the apothecary's garden, where lavender and rue grew in cracked pots. Past the shrine of a forgotten goddess, where someone had left a child's tooth wrapped in ribbon. Past the square where jugglers tossed blades into the air while pretending not to notice the pickpockets at their feet. At the base of the Capitoline he stopped. A small gathering stood before the magistrate's court. 2 slaves stood shackled near the steps, their heads bowed, their arms bruised. A man in crimson robes read from a wax tablet, accusation, sentence, consequence. The words were clear. The crowd listened without passion. Cassian watched. He didn't know the men, but he knew the rhythm of the moment. One of the guards moved forward, uncoiled a whip, struck once. Cassian flinched, not from surprise, but from memory. He turned and walked away before the second blow fell. Later he found himself near the garden wall where the green-eyed girl had passed days ago. The wall was quiet now, but in the shade of a fig tree he saw a thin thread of cloth tied to a branch, red, frayed, waving in the wind like a flag too small to be noticed. He untied it carefully and placed it in his satchel. That evening, as dusk slid down the hills, he returned to the temple. The figures greeted him like old friends. He placed the new fox beside them, aligning its nose toward the east. Then he unfolded the tapestry and sat. He did not eat. He did not carve. He lit a small flame, just a stub of wax, and placed it beside the figures. The light flickered against their faces, and for the first time, it looked as if they were watching him too. The 20th morning came with the hush of a long-held breath. The sky was thick with grey, but not the colour of storms, more like wool, stretched and worn thin by time. It dulled the sun, softened the edges of rooftops, turned Rome into a painting muted by ash. Cassian opened his eyes slowly. He had not slept deeply. The flame he lit the night before had long since burned down to a pool of wax, and though the city had remained quiet in the dark hours, his mind had not. Dreams came in flashes, faces without names, the ache of footsteps, the hollow thud of amphorae against wood. Still he rose without complaint. The tapestry felt heavier this morning, as though it had drawn the weight of his thoughts into its folds. He folded it gently, tucked it into its place behind the broken wall, and stood for a moment in silence, his gaze resting on the 4 figures now lined along the stone. The birds, the fox, the shape that saw without needing to move. They looked small, but whole. He walked into the city without a clear destination. The streets were quieter than usual. Perhaps the dull sky had pushed people inward. Or perhaps some part of the city had agreed, wordlessly, that this was a morning for silence. The fountain near the butcher's square trickled faintly. A dog lay curled beneath a market stall, its eyes open but slow. A few men stood near a shuttered wine shop, speaking in low tones. Cassian passed them without notice. He turned into the narrow alleys near the booksellers, where parchment hung in windows like flags and the air smelled of old leather, ink and dust. He slowed there, drawn by instinct. His fingers brushed the edge of a scroll tied with red string. He didn't enter the shop. He couldn't read much, but he liked the way the letters curled, the way they hinted at secrets just beyond his reach. At the end of the street, he turned left instead of right. And there she was, the green-eyed girl. She stood at a basin outside a dye shop, her arms deep in purple water, wringing cloth that stained her fingers. Her hair was tied back with a strip of grey linen. Her movements were strong, practiced. Cassian paused across the street. She didn't see him at first. Then she did. Their eyes met. No words, just a moment. She turned back to her work, lifted the cloth and draped it over a wooden rack to dry. The purple ran in slow rivulets along the grain. Cassian moved on. He reached the river by midday, where the water was low and brown. A man stood waist-deep, searching for something beneath the surface with a long hook. Others watched from the bank, offering guesses or silence. No one asked if he needed help. Cassian sat on the wall above them and ate a small crust of bread he'd saved from 2 nights ago. It was dry, but familiar. When he stood, he walked not to the olive press, not to the forum, not even to the marketplace. He went instead to the necropolis, the place of the dead. The gates were open, always open. Death had no need for locks. He stepped inside and moved between the tombs slowly. Some were marked with names, others with carvings, some with only broken stones and weeds. He walked until he reached a small mausoleum tucked between 2 larger ones. Its front was cracked, and ivy curled around its base. Cassian knelt there. Not because he knew who lay inside, but because it was quiet. He untied his satchel and took out the fox. He placed it gently at the foot of the tomb, a gift, an offering. He did not speak aloud, but in his chest he said, "This is what I've made. This is what I carry." Then he stood, left the figure where it lay, and walked back through the rows. By the time he returned to the city's heart, the clouds had begun to shift, not to break, but to thin. Light returned slowly, like someone waking from a long sleep. At the temple, Cassian laid the tapestry down and sat beside his remaining figures. He stared at them a long time. then reached into his satchel and pulled out the red thread he'd taken from the fig tree. He tied it carefully around the neck of the smaller bird, not tight, just enough to hold, a mark, not of ownership, but of remembrance. He leaned back, let the wind rise across the hill, and closed his eyes. His hands at last were still. The 21st day arrived not with grandeur, but with breath, cool and soft, brushing gently across the city's rooftops like a mother smoothing a child's hair. The sky was pale and clean, the kind of blue that came only after long grey days had folded themselves quietly into memory. It smelled faintly of water and fig bark and old sun-warmed marble. Cassian rose slowly from the tapestry, his eyes still heavy with sleep, his body quiet. There had been no dreams that night, only stillness. He sat upright, legs crossed, and stared at the 3 remaining figures arranged beside him on the stone, the 2 birds and the low creature whose name he had never spoken aloud. The fox he had given away, the others he kept. He leaned forward and adjusted the bird with the red thread, lifting its beak slightly. The thread had held through the night. Its knot was small and perfect, and somehow it made the figure feel less like a carving and more like a name. He packed the figures gently into his satchel, folded the tapestry into its hollow behind the wall, and stood. The city below waited, not impatiently, but attentively. He walked down from the temple steps with steady feet, the morning light casting long, soft lines across his path. At the foot of the hill, he passed a group of young boys playing dice with cracked bones. One of them looked up and smiled, a gap in his teeth giving him a crooked charm. Cassian smiled back, but didn't stop. He had somewhere to be. At the market's edge, near the bread stalls, the old weaver stood beside her loom, spinning thread in long, patient pulls. She nodded to Cassian as he passed and held up a small bundle wrapped in cloth, rough wool tied with twine. "For your feet," she took it carefully and opened it just enough to see what lay inside. Strips of soft leather, sandal ties. Cassian looked up, startled. "You're barefoot too often," she said simply. "They'll last longer than twine." He pressed his hand to his chest, a silent thank you, then tucked the bundle into his satchel and walked on. The olive press was quiet when he arrived. The old man was seated in the same place as always, but there were fewer figures today. Only 2 birds and a small stone dog, its ears crooked. The man was not carving. He sat with his hands resting on his knees, his gaze turned outward toward the city. Cassian joined him in silence. After a while, the man spoke. "You gave one away," Cassian nodded, "to the dead." The old man did not answer immediately. Then he said, "Good. The dead listen better than most." Cassian pulled the smallest bird from his satchel and handed it over. "Burn the eye," he said. The old man took it without a word, reached for the wire and brazier, and held the point in the coals until it glowed faint orange. Then he passed the tool to Cassian. This time, his hand didn't shake. He pressed the metal gently into the side of the figure's face, let the heat bite the wood, and drew back. A single perfect mark. Then another. The figure breathed, not with lungs, but with presence. Cassian set it down beside the others. The old man looked at him. "You'll leave soon." It wasn't a question. Cassian nodded. The city no longer frightened him, but something in him had begun to stretch slowly, like a root reaching past the edge of its pot. "I don't know where," he said quietly. "You'll know when you're ready." They said nothing more. Cassian stood, lifted his satchel and gave a small bow. The old man gave a smaller one in return. He wandered slowly through the city after that, as if memorizing it for the last time. The cracks in the walls, the uneven stones beneath his feet, the voices, sharp, soft, laughing, swearing, a dog barking from a rooftop, the clang of a smith's hammer, the call of a fruit seller who sang instead of shouted. Near the gate where soldiers passed in and out, he stood for a while and watched the road. It led out into hills, past aqueducts, past fields, toward names he did not yet know. But it was a road, and it was open. As the sky deepened toward dusk, he returned once more to the temple. The wind had picked up, cool and steady. He climbed the steps, unrolled the tapestry, and placed the bird with the burned eyes beside the others. He sat beside them, then reached into his satchel and pulled out the sandal ties. He didn't wear them yet. He only laid them in his lap and watched the horizon. That night there were no stars, only the wind. And in its breath, Cassian heard something he had never heard before. his own name, spoken as if it belonged somewhere. The 22nd day opened with a sky that shimmered faintly, as though the early light had scattered through glass. There was a stillness in the air, not the hush of dread or the silence of sleep, but the calm of clarity. The birds sang early, and their song was high and strange, not jubilant but melodic, like the memory of something once cherished. Cassian opened his eyes before the sun had risen fully. He had not truly slept. His body had rested. Yes, curled against the folded tapestry, his arms loose around the satchel, but his mind had wandered. Not through dreams, but through moments. A fig left in a wall's crook, a stranger's cloth, the press of heat into wood, names he hadn't spoken, roads he hadn't walked. He sat up slowly. The sky was beginning to lighten along the eastern rim of the city, casting the temple ruins in gentle blue. The wind had dropped. The city, not yet loud, breathed quietly below. He reached into his satchel and removed the sandal ties. Today, he wore them. The leather felt soft but strong against his feet. He laced them tight, looped the cords with care, then stood. The figures, 3 now, watched him from the stone edge where he had lined them the night before. The smallest bird with its burnt eyes. The wren. The heavier one whose shape still had no name. He touched each one gently, then placed them back into his satchel, wrapped carefully in a piece of cloth he had cut from the tapestry's frayed hem. He would not leave them behind. Not yet. He stepped into the day with a strange stillness in his chest. Not fear, not urgency, just a readiness. The streets welcomed him with their old rituals, brooms against stone, water poured from window basins, the low chants of priests from distant corners. A vendor called out about eggs. A boy chased a hoop made of vine. Somewhere a drunk cursed the morning. Cassian passed them all like a ghost wrapped in flesh. He made his way toward the olive press, half expecting not to find the old man there. But he was, and he was waiting. The cloth had only one figure on it, a dog's mouth slightly open, ears forward. The man didn't greet him with words. He simply nodded and handed him a different tool, shorter, sharper, with a bone handle smoothed by years. "For the final cuts," he said. Cassian took it and sat. He didn't ask what the figure was meant to become. He didn't ask if this was a test or a farewell. He only carved, slowly, deliberately, letting the shape rise through his hands. The tool felt right in his grip, as though it had always belonged there. The wood resisted at first, but then it yielded. And when the final curve was cut, the final line drawn, Cassian looked down at what he had made. A heron. Tall, neck curved, wings pressed close to its sides. Eyes closed. Still. Not in flight, not in fear, just still. The old man reached for it, examined it once, then set it down beside the dog. He said nothing for a long while. Then he whispered, "You've stopped trying." Cassian looked at him. The man smiled just slightly. "You're not carving to escape anymore. You're carving to stay." Cassian didn't know how to answer that. So he didn't. He stood and bowed. This time the old man stood too. "Wherever you go," he said, "don't forget the weight of wood in your hands." Cassian nodded, then turned. He walked until the press disappeared behind the curve of a wall, behind rooftops, behind memory. By midday, he found himself standing at the edge of the city. Not far from the gate where oxen passed and soldiers checked names. The road stretched ahead, long, pale, whispering dust. In the distance, the hills rolled like sleeping beasts beneath the sky. Cassian didn't step through yet. He sat on a flat stone just beside the road and opened his satchel. He laid out the 3 figures again, the bird with the red thread, the one with the eyes, the heavy, nameless one. He did not speak to them, but he looked at each in turn, and then, after a long moment, he placed them gently on the stone wall, all 3 in a neat row, each facing a different direction. Not left behind, left watching. He tied the satchel shut, stood, and with sandals wrapped tight and shoulders straight, he walked down the road. He did not look back. The 23rd day did not begin in Rome. It began on the road, dusty, open, sunlit and strange. Cassian walked with the steady rhythm of someone not yet sure where he was going, but certain that he should not stop. His sandals left shallow prints in the pale dirt, each one swallowed quickly by the breeze. Around him, the countryside stretched like a held breath, fields tilled but empty, olive trees flickering with silver-green leaves, the hills beyond rising slow and soft. Behind him, the city had vanished, swallowed by the curve of the land. He did not miss it yet. He had not walked far. Half a day, perhaps. But distance was not measured only in miles. It was also measured in memory. And already he had begun to feel the silence pressing at the edges of his thoughts, the quiet hum that came when familiar voices no longer surrounded him. He passed a shepherd at mid-morning, a boy younger than himself, barefoot, with a reed flute tucked into his belt. The sheep clustered around him like clouds. The boy nodded as Cassian passed, and Cassian nodded back. No words, just witness. He drank from a roadside stream later that afternoon, cupping water in his hands and watching the ripples fan outward. The water was clear and cold, and when he wiped his mouth, the back of his hand smelled faintly of clay and thyme. He sat for a while in the shade of a bent tree, its roots cracked through stone. From there, he could see the road winding ahead, vanishing between two distant hills. He took out the satchel and rested it on his knees, unopened. Not yet. When the sun began to dip, the sky flushed with quiet gold, he reached a small hamlet, barely a cluster of homes with tiled roofs and wooden beams. There was no gate, no guards, just chickens pecking near a well and smoke curling from a chimney. Cassian didn't ask for food. He didn't ask for shelter. He passed through like a shadow beneath the last light. An old woman sweeping a threshold paused and looked at him. "You're from the city," she said, not accusing, not inviting, just noticing. Cassian nodded. "Left it behind," he said softly. She studied him a moment longer, then returned to her sweeping. Farther down the road, he found an empty terrace beside a crumbling wall where grapes hung low and forgotten. He set down his satchel, unrolled the tapestry, and sat with his back against the stone. The stars came quickly in the country, clearer than in Rome, sharper, quieter. The night air smelled of bark and distant fire. Cassian pulled his satchel close and opened it slowly. Inside, the cloth still held its shape, folded neatly around the final figure, the heron. He unwrapped it, placed it beside him, and stared. It looked different out here, its stillness no longer a contrast to the noise, but a mirror of the land. He traced the edge of its wing with one finger, then set it on the wall. It faced west, toward the hills, toward what came next. He wrapped the satchel again and placed it beneath his head. The tapestry around his shoulders, the heron beside him, the stars above. And for the first time he slept not like a boy on stone, but like a traveller beneath the sky. The 24th morning came like a hush broken by breath. The wind stirred gently through the tall grass and the leaves of the nearby olive trees, whispering softly to itself. The sky was cloudless, a wide canvas of pale gold stretched above the hills. It was not a triumphant sunrise, nor dramatic. It was quiet, graceful, like a curtain rising without fanfare. Cassian opened his eyes before the first bird called. His body was stiff from the night, his limbs pressed against the hard terrace stone. But he did not mind. He sat slowly, wrapping the tapestry more tightly around his shoulders, and looked west, toward the hills, toward the path that waited, toward the world beyond. Beside him the heron remained, still and dignified, not watching over him, not guarding, simply present. Cassian reached out and took it gently in his hands. The grain of the wood was smoother now, as though the night wind had touched it too. He studied the way the neck curved, the way the wings pressed close to the sides, and something in his chest softened. He didn't return it to the satchel. Instead, he stood with it still in his hand. Below the terrace, the valley unfolded with early light, rows of wheat just beginning to wake, stone paths snaking through groves, a cart drawn by a slow mule rolling eastward in the far distance. He stood there a long while, letting the breeze tangle his hair, feeling the weight of the figure in his palm. Then he walked. He left the terrace behind without looking back, taking the narrow footpath that wound between the vineyards and the old irrigation channels. The road was uneven and dry, the stones warm already beneath his sandals. The heron rode in the crook of his arm. As he walked, memories came, not sharply, not with pain, just as shapes, voices, echoes. The old man's hands, scarred and sure. The green-eyed girl rinsing cloth in purple water. The warmth of the tapestry on a night when Rome had no stars. And a name whispered in the wind. Not by gods, not by ghosts, his own. The path led him to a low ridge where the land opened again. He climbed it slowly, pausing at the top. From here he could see even farther, past the silver river curling through the plain, past scattered villas, past fields still waiting for spring. He sat and placed the heron beside him, letting it face forward. The day passed without words. He ate what little bread remained, drank from a stream that trickled near the roots of a bent tree, and watched the sky deepen. The sun moved slowly behind the hills. Shadows stretched, and still he waited. Not for someone, not for a sign, just to know when it was time to continue. At dusk he stood. The heron remained on the stone. He looked at it a long time. Then he crouched and placed one hand on its back. "You've come far enough," he whispered, and he meant it. He walked away without taking it, down the hill, across the field, into the deepening dark. His satchel was lighter now. His feet found rhythm again, and his breath matched the wind. He did not hurry. He did not fear. He simply walked. And somewhere behind him, beneath the stars, the heron watched the world grow quiet once more.